Have you ever want to add in a sign in with GitHub button to your page? Well, I did, and in this video, I'm going to show you everything I learned about how to log into GitHub, how to add it to your website. When adding this button, we're also going to look at the intricacies of how OpenID Connect works, how oAuth 2 works, and how we can use this with a robust backend system using AWS Cognito, Lambdas, and user pools. So I really deep dive in this video, so I hope you guys learned a lot. I really wanted to learn like the underlying mechanism of how oAuth 2 works, how we can use that in an AWS infrastructure backend, but also how you can connect it to your front end website and make it all work. We're also going to use AWS Amplify Gen2, which allows us to create our backend infrastructure as code, which is going to make it really easy and straightforward to like make updates and changes. We can also add a sandbox for multiple users, so we'll deep dive into that as well. Leave a comment below if you like these in-depth videos like this. Let's jump into it. Let's look at oAuth 2.0. So if you look at the authorization oAuth apps guide that GitHub provides, it basically says that you need to use GitHub apps with oAuth 2.0 to be able to do the login that you need. And if you're not familiar with oAuth 2.0, it's basically an industry standard protocol for authorization. So don't get this confused with authentication. Authorization is essentially a way that you can prove your credentials to another provider, to another place. In this case, we want to be able to log in with GitHub and then use those credentials to get the GitHub information that we need. And then we can also use this information so we can protect endpoints. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let me show you kind of a quick rundown of how oAuth 2 works and how we're going to be using it in this application today. So I have Excalidraw here. I have oAuth 2.0. On the left-hand side, I have my client, which we'll just assume is the user. And this is the website. Now, when I say the website, this also can include any server routes, if you're using like Nuxt or Next or Lambda functions, things like that. And then on the server side, this is more of GitHub, like connecting to GitHub. It says here in the guides for GitHub that we need to request a user's GitHub identity using this oAuth authorize. We're going to put an arrow over here, and then essentially we're going to do a get to this right here. And we're also going to send some other things over. So it says here you can send over client ID, required redirect URI, login. So in this GET request, at the minimum, we probably want to send over the client ID and the scope. So these two things we're going to send over in this request. And that is the first part. And what happens on the server side, it'll actually, in the GitHub side, it'll pop up. If you haven't logged in before, it'll bring you into a login page. If you haven't logged in, it'll ask you, do you authorize this website to use to grab this information? And it'll tell you what information that it'll have. And scope, you can think of scope as like what sort of information you're looking for. After you authorize with the GitHub server and log in, and it's going to return essentially a code. And this code will have a bunch of numbers, numerals. It won't mean anything to us, but this code will be important because this is what our server is, our client is going to use to be able to get something called an access token. You actually, once you get that code back, you have to make another call to this post. So let's add another line here. The client is then going to reach back out to GitHub, and then we're also going to send over the code. So this will have the code being sent over to this access token endpoint. Then this is going to return back. The access token. And this is usually a JWT token. And this is going to give us access and allow us to make calls, authenticated calls to GitHub. The website's going to call back the GitHub, but maybe a different URL. It'll send over usually that access token in the authorization header. So then this user will then return back any information you want, like the user information, including like your email, real name, your first name, last name, things like that. So that's essentially how oAuth works. You're able to get the access token, and now you can talk to GitHub as if you're a logged in user. So this client, this website will have access to whatever you granted access to during this part where you authorize at the beginning. So this works great for just authorization, but we want to have this connected to our website. We want to save user information. We want to be able to connect to protected routes. So let's take a look at the AWS side of things. So here is our graph of our AWS account and what we're going to create today to be able to talk to this GitHub backend. We're going to add in an API gateway. An API gateway is a way to protect our REST endpoints. We can set up rate limiting. We can set up connections to other internal parts of AWS, other Lambda functions or other services. So right now we're going to just use it as kind of a gateway to all our Lambda functions that we're going to set up. So we're going to have an API gateway. Then we're going to have 3 different Lambda functions, a user, and this is going to be talking to the gateway. We also have a private, and then we're going to set up a token. And I'll explain why we need all 3 of these. The way this works is the user will be a Lambda to grab GitHub user information. So in this last part right here, where we grab the user information, email, last name, this is going to be a Lambda function that's going to make a call to this. One thing I didn't mention is that when we at this part right here in the function, in this flow, when we retrieve the access token, usually you do a post request here, but you do it on a server, like a Lambda function. You don't want to send this from the client because you also have to send in the client secret in this post call. So we'll definitely need a endpoint to hit or REST endpoint to do this functionality. The private will be an example of how we can protect a route or a endpoint that can only be used by authorized and authenticated users. And then we're going to create a token, which is going to grab us that access token right here. So we'll need to have something that grabs this access token, just like we had one that grabs this user information. Cognito will be our identity provider, and our identity provider does a few things. I'll explain in a moment what those do, but it's a way to track who the users are in our system, the attributes attached to them. Have this API gateway, it'll be talking back and forth because we're going to create something called a gateway authorizer. And what this is the API gateway, when it wants to talk to, like, let's say this private Lambda, it's going to be connected to an authorizer that says, oh, this user has to be authorized to be able to talk to this private one. While these other ones you can access if you're a public user. To give a little bit more clarity too, we'll have here on this side here, let me move this over. We'll have a client. So this will be like your web browser. And this web browser will be talking directly to Cognito. It'll be talking back over. It'll also be talking to the API gateway. We'll be talking back over. So like for every time you log in, you're going to have this login will be talking directly to Cognito. It'll be grabbing some tokens that it'll use to authenticate when it goes to the API gateway. And so this will be our REST API. So every time we talk to the API gateway, we're going to talk to these Lambda functions in the background here. One other thing to realize too is after you log in, it's going to give us an access token, identity token, and a refresh token. One really nice thing is on the client side, we're going to use our AWS Amplify JS library, which is going to handle all that hard, heavy lifting of taking the JWT and access tokens and refreshing them. Because what happens is this access token and identity token will expire after a certain period of time, and then you have to use the refresh token to get new ones. And that kind of logic is all built into the JavaScript library that we're going to use. And we use these tokens to be able to talk to the API gateway and talk to protected routes like our private route that we're going to have. So let's take a look a little bit more inside Cognito. Okay, so Cognito will be our identity provider. So this is the service that AWS offers to handle our authentication and authorization. And we really want to make sure that when we connect to this OAuth 2.0 to GitHub, that we save these credentials and then we can use them inside our app and we can use that access token and everything works correctly. So there's a couple of pieces of this. One is that inside Cognito, you can add in user pools, and user pools have a few specific purposes. One is to hold in users. As you expect, a user pool holds your information. So anytime anybody signs in or creates a new account, it's held inside the user pool. You can see anything about that user that you can ask for certain attributes when they log in. That's another thing is attributes. So when they log in, When you sign up for the first time, you can ask them certain things. You can save that information into the user. You can save other things too. It also has like the password policy for that user. So it has, maybe you require a certain amount of lowercase letters or uppercase letters, but all those settings and everything is configured inside the user pool. And you can have multiple user pools if you so choose. And then another big part of the user pool is the user pool client. So the user pool client is a way you can access the user pool. So you can have multiple clients in one user pool, and you can have different settings for each of those clients. And so some of the settings you can set in the user pool client is like your auth flows. So you can have SRP, or you can have oAuth, or you can use something called the Cognito hosted UI, which is a different type of flow. And then you can also set your refresh settings. And so, for example, you can have the access token expire after 10 days or 5 days or 30 days or whatever you want. So it has a lot of different settings there. And then you also can set up the hosted UI. And hosted UI is a way that once you log in, it's almost like if you use login through GitHub, like we've been talking about, or Facebook, it'll redirect you to a website, but this is your own like external login page hosted by Cognito, and then you can log in, and then it redirects you back, and it uses oAuth behind the scenes to do that. To be able to set up this oAuth 2.0 with GitHub, there's a couple of different ways. One is you use something called OIDC, or OpenID Connect. And unfortunately, oAuth, at least this way, through the way they recommend through authorizing OAuth apps, it doesn't support OpenID Connect. And what OpenID Connect is usually OAuth 2.0 is just meant for authorization, but when you add in OpenID Connect, you also get some of that authentication as well. And usually the biggest difference is when this point right here, when you do this post call and you send over the code and it sends back the access code, it actually also sends back an identity token as well. And that helps you make sure that this user is from this server. So it's like another layer and level of security. Unfortunately, since GitHub does not support it, and that's not the way that they recommend, you can set up your own OpenID provider inside Cognito and kind of create all the endpoints that you need. And I'll show you how that works. So let's say here, we're going to create this. We'll zoom in a little bit. We'll have this be our GitHub OIDC identity provider. And OIDC is the OpenID Connect. And inside here, we'll be talking directly to the user pool client. So this will come over here, and this will go right over here. And so you can connect GitHub OIDC identity provider directly into your user pool client. And once that happens, you can log in via GitHub, and then it'll store that information for that user, and you get to select what user information you want to store as attributes inside the user pool. And then you can use this back up here. Once that's connected, we can use it as an authorizer, and only certain users will be able to check or connect to this private Lambda function. Let's take a look a little bit closer at this OIDC provider that we're going to create. So the OIDC provider has a few things that it asks for. One is the client ID. If we go all the way back to OAuth 2.0, part right here, we have this client ID, and then later on, we actually send over the client secret with this code. Those are both, we actually have to register an app with GitHub, and they'll give us that client ID and client secret. So that's exactly what we'll need to set up the GitHub OIDC provider. So we'll have the client ID. We'll also give it the client secret from GitHub. And then we're going to obviously provide it the user pool that we just created. And then one big part of it is it's going to have these endpoints. And these endpoints are going to ask us some information. So it's going to ask us for the authorization URL. It's going to ask us for the token URL, the user info URL, and the JWKS URI, which stands for the OIDC IDP JSON web key set. So you need to find these 4 URLs. And since we know that GitHub doesn't support the OpenID Connect through the OAuth apps that it recommends, there is a way to do OpenID Connect if you're using GitHub Actions, but that's completely different. So we're not going to get those too confused. That we actually have to do all this ourselves because OAuth 2.0 doesn't send over identity token. It doesn't have these correct endpoints for us to use. It has some though. So for the authorization endpoint, we know that we can use this one right here, this GitHub login OAuth authorize. That's the same one. So we have that one. Now for the token one, we'll need to create a Lambda, and then that Lambda will need to essentially access this access token and grab that information and send it back. So we need to create our own Lambda function to do that part. And then same thing for user info. We need to create a user Lambda, and that user Lambda is going to talk to this API github.com/users. It's going to send back an object in a way so that we can map it to the attributes in our user pool. So we'll need to create that. And the JWKS URI actually can be the same URL as the token. So that'll be the same using the same Lambda function. So once we set up the API gateway and we have all these Lambda setups, we'll have these URLs available, and then we'll plug them all into this GitHub OIDC provider. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what we're going to do today. So let's jump into the code and look at how we're going to do this. We'll need to set up our GitHub OAuth app so that way we can use it inside our application. We'll need that client ID and client secret. So to do that, I logged into GitHub into the developer settings. You can go to settings/developers, or you can go into your profile here, click settings, and then go down to developer settings, and you'll see this page. Now I have a few older apps in here, but let's create a new one. I'm gonna click new OAuth app, and I'm gonna call this the AWS GitHub login. And then it's gonna ask me for a homepage URL. Now we're gonna create this later on using the Cognito host. So I know for a fact that I'm gonna give it this domain name. I'm gonna give it this domain prefix name, this test-eric-domain-github. So for the homepage URL, I just need to put that login URL that I'll be creating in a moment. And then for the authorization callback URL, I'll put the same URL in, that test-eric-domain-github, and then instead I'll do OAuth 2/ID response. So I'll go ahead and click register app here, and then this will go ahead and register it. So after it's registered, it's going to give us a client ID and a client secret. You can click generate new client secret and it'll give you one. I went ahead and did that off camera, but I went and copied that client ID and client secret because I'll need to use that later. I can also always go back in here later and change these URLs if I need. To begin, we are going to be using a Nuxt application in the front end, and then we're going to use AWS in the back end. Now, if you're following along and you're using Nuxt or Astro or any other front end framework, don't worry. This is going to be very agnostic. You can use any framework you want to do what I'm using today. Just for the sake of simplicity, I'm using Nuxt. Now, to get started, I'm going to assume you already have an AWS account. If you don't, you can get one for free. I'll put a link in the description. And then we're going to use the new Amplify New Code First DX Gen2 to get started. I also did a full stack tutorial on this earlier. I'll put a link in the description too if you guys want a little bit more information. So we're going to go a little bit quicker, but let's assume that you're brand new. You can click the Get Started at docs.amplify.aws/gen2. We now have a new Next.js app router section, which I'm happy about. I went ahead and created the Nuxt app beforehand, so we can skip that part. Essentially what we need to do is we need to run this command. So here is my folder, and inside my Nuxt app, I'm just going to copy and paste this in. This npm create amplify at latest. And I'm going to OK to proceed. And this is going to create the scaffolding for the new Amplify backend that we want to add in for our AWS backend. Okay, great, it's done. Now, if we follow the Get Starting guide, it's going to tell you to run npm run dev, and then you can run this npx amplify sandbox command, and that's going to create a sandbox environment for us. And then we can make some updates and changes. And by the way, if at this point you don't have an account, you can configure your AWS account to use Amplify. So there's this npx amplify configure profile, and this will allow it so you can connect to AWS on the command line. I already did that already, so I'll skip that part. But if you are following along this tutorial and you don't have an AWS account and you're setting up your command line for the first time, you'll need to configure to run this command. Actually skip the rest of this getting started tutorial to get up and running here without it. And it's because our app is going to be a little bit different. So now I have this new Amplify folder, and you can kind of take a look at what's in it. We have this resource, which has, this will create a Cognito backend and user pool for us. We can set social providers, external providers. We can set user attributes. So let's start here to get our backend up and running with the GitHub login. For first, I'm just going to delete a few things here. And so email true, yep, that's good. Now in external providers, we want to set up our callback URLs. So this is the addresses that we're going to need once we connect to our GitHub login, our federated GitHub login. It's going to redirect back to us, and we want to redirect to this site. Since we're using this locally, I'm just going to use localhost. If this was in production, we would put in the correct URL domain name. And then we're going to have something called logout URLs. And here is where I'll put basically the same one, this localhost 3000. And now for user attributes, we can also add in other things like multi-factor authentication. We don't really need to do that. So for user attributes, I'm going to add a few in. First, we want email. And required, we're going to have true, and mutable true. No, typically with emails, they don't change, but since we're using GitHub and the email coming from GitHub could change, I'll make it mutable. And then we'll use preferred username, and we'll actually from here this is required false, and then mutable true as well. And then the last attribute that I want to have is the profile picture. So we'll do required false here, mutable true. And so these are attributes that we're going to retrieve from the basically the GitHub user authenticated endpoint. And then in the backend file, this is how everything is going to be put together. So this is where it's going to generate the auth or Cognito user pool that we just created, and it's also going to create the AppSync data. Like I said, I'm not going to change this. We could delete it if we want. I'm going to leave it as is. Now, one thing we need to do is we need to create a hosted UI. So I'm going to create this backend here, this variable called backend. And what's really nice, this is all typed. So underneath this Amplify folder and everything we're doing here, it's basically powered by CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit for AWS, which allows us to create infrastructure as code. And so we can get access to these resources and add additional stacks if we want. We have a create stack here, and we can create our whole backend. So right now, as of this recording, we only have auth and data as kind of this kind of higher level construct. But in the future, we're going to add in more things like storage, Lambda functions, things like that. So it'll be a very straightforward way to add those resources in. But for now, we can drop back down to our what they call level 2 or level 3 constructs using CDK to add more infrastructure. And that's what we're going to do. So first, we want to make sure that we add in a domain name. So in that previous step, when I created the new app for GitHub, I had to put in the domain names for the auth, and I'll need to create that now. So I'm going to, I think I'll call this Cognito domain. And then inside here, you can see here, we need to put the Cognito domain and then the domain prefix. Now, if we look back at what we put in before, we had this test Erik, I believe was the domain. So let me grab that. So I'll just put in right here, test Erik domain -GitHub. And so this will create the domain name that we need for this. But we need a few other things to get this up and running. We need a GitHub provider. We need the API gateway. We need some Lambda functions. The way I like to do this is I'm going to create a few folders, and we're going to create a new stack. And this new stack is going to do everything from creating the GitHub provider OIDC to the API gateway and the Lambda functions. I'm going to create a brand new folder here. So I'm going to call it custom. And then, yeah, we'll do custom first. And then inside custom, we're going to have a few things. First, I'm going to create a new file called GitHub provider.ts. And then we'll probably want to also create a new folder here called API, and this is where we're going to have our Lambda functions. Inside the Lambda functions, we can create those first. I think that would be easier, and then we can connect it up to our new GitHub provider. So we're going to have 3 files here. We're going to have a private.ts. That's going to be our private Lambda. We're going to have our token Lambda. And then our third will be our user Lambda. So let's start with the private one. One thing we need to do first is we need to get types. So every time I deal with Lambdas, I want to have the right types. So I'll install that real quickly. Let's do npm I at types / AWS Lambda. And we can put tacd, so that's a development dependency. All right. So let's see if we can import this in. I'm going to copy and paste this from my other screen. This one here, this API gateway proxy with Cognito authorization handler, it just makes it a little easier to create Lambdas. So we can also, by the way, you can notice we're using TypeScript here. It's smart enough to during the compile step, it'll create this, it'll change it back to JavaScript. It'll compile it back to JavaScript, so we don't have to do that ourselves. All right, so we're going to have a handler here, and that's going to be that type, that API gateway proxy Cognito handler. And it's going to be async event. And already it's giving us a few errors, but we'll fix it. We're going to return, and it's going to return a status code of 200. And it's just, this is really simple. We're just going to return a string that gives some information. So I'm just going to do a string that says hello user. Yeah, I think that's all I want in there. And then I'll have some headers, and this is just to make sure that we don't have any issues with cores. So the next part we'll need to do is, let's do the token one next. And this one is also going to include an npm package we'll need to install. So it's called Lambda multi-part parser, and we'll install as a dependency, a development dependency again. I'll go ahead and import both of these in. So now I have my API gateway proxy handler and this new parser. So we'll export const handler. We'll do the API gateway proxy handler, async e. What's nice about this Lambda multi-part parser is now I can do something like this. I can await parser.parse and then pass in the e to it. And now I have access to the values inside of it. And so I'm going to create this URL, and this login OAuth access token, if we go back to our documentation of how to do it, it's essentially, I'm looking at this login OAuth access token right here. So this is going to be the Lambda function that grabs the access token. And we need to pass in a few things to make this work. We're going to pass in the client ID, the client secret, and most importantly, the code. So we'll need to make sure that this Lambda function basically sends us this code. Otherwise, this won't work. And remember, the client ID and client secret we already have. And then we'll need to send back, we'll essentially need to connect to this URL and send information back. So let's do a try catch block. And we'll say if something goes wrong, we'll console log error, and we'll put this in here, and then we'll need to return something. So we'll return status code 500, and then JSON.stringify error, so we can know what's happening. But in the try block is where we want to do the call to this URL, and we'll need to do a post. So if we go fetch here, URL, and remember, since we're using Node 18, we have access to this fetch. We don't need to import any sort of fetch here. We're gonna do method, and this is going to be type post. We're gonna do headers, and we'll accept application JSON. And then once we receive something back from that, we'll await the response.json. And then we'll return the values. So we want to return that. So we'll do status code 200 here. We'll body, we'll JSON stringify the token that it's going to use. All right, so 2 Lambda functions, 2 done. Oh, by the way, this should be E. There we go. So this 2 functions done here. And now we need to do the last one, which is user. And I'm going to import this in here, and we'll export the handler, API gateway proxy handler, async event. And then from here, this is the user information. By this way, this should be handler. And what we want to do is when you connect to this endpoint, you have to pass in an authorization header. So first we'll make sure that, if someone does that, they actually send it over. And then we'll do a try catch. And I'm going to copy and paste this just for the sake of time, but I'll explain it here. So we're going to do another fetch, and this time we're going to do it to that API GitHub user. So this endpoint will return back all the user information. If we go back to our Scala draw, remember this is the one that will turn back the user information, the email, first name and last name. So we're going to do a GET request to it, and then we're going to send that authorization header that was passed in, and we're going to send it into the token. We do token here. We're going to send the authorization. Basically, the response is going to look, the authorization header is going to look something like this: authorization. It's going to have a bearer, and then it's going to have a token, and it's going to have some information here. So we want to make sure that we grab the bearer token out and we pull the information out, so that way we can send it to this endpoint. And then as long as everything works, it'll return back an ID. And then we're going to have this sub, which is something that we need for Cognito to understand everything. This is going to map to the sub, and then everything else is going to be in there. And this token will essentially have all the email, it'll have the avatar URL, it'll have everything else. So we'll just spread it on, and it'll be returned. Perfect. At this point, if I wanted to, I could test this locally, but for the sake of this video, I'll let you guys do that. And this code will be available in the description below, so you can follow along and copy and paste this in as well yourself. All right, so we have now the 3 different endpoints, but we still need a few other things. First, we need this GitHub provider. We probably want to make sure that we send it some information. So let's set this up so that way we can get this new GitHub provider working. So I'm going to do const existing stack. I'm going to use this stack of, I'm going to import in stack here from AWS CDK Lib core. And I'm going to do stack of here. And this will be, and probably for the best bet too, is we'll install AWS CDK Lib as a dependency. It might give you some warnings, but it should be fine. If you need to, you can do -- force if you have to. All right, so we have this stack. So we can do stack of, and we'll pass in backend.auth.resources.userpool. And then we can grab some information that we need. So we're going to destructure this auth.resources, and we'll need to grab a couple of things: user pool and user pool client. So what this is saying is that we're going to take an existing resource, our user pool. We're going to create a new stack in a moment, but we're also going to grab the user pool and user pool client that was created here, and we're going to use that information to create this new GitHub provider and API gateway. Let's go into the GitHub provider and set that up. I am going to copy and paste a whole bunch of stuff here. And so this is all coming from different parts of the libraries we already have installed. So with the AWS CDK lib, this constructs, this backend, we'll be needing to use all this later. So I'm going to export a type, GitHub provider. And so this is some things that it will be needing to get set up, we'll need in this provider to get it all working. So I'm going to need the user pool client, the client ID, which is a backend secret, and a client secret. And this backend secret is of type secret, so we'll see in a second how we can add secrets. Now we're going to create a class. We're going to call it GitHub provider. It's going to extend construct. We're going to have a few variables here that we're going to expose. We're going to have API URL, and provider. And then we're going to create a constructor. So let's take a look at this constructor. So right here, this is taking in the GitHub provider props, which I misspelt. There it is, capital H. And this should be provider props. And this will essentially create our new stack for us. And so we'll need to pass in all these values, and we'll need these to create everything we need to create. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to comment this out, and let's go back to the back end, and let's see if we can instantiate this new class. So I'm going to instantiate the new GitHub provider. I'm going to pass in that existing stack, and I'm going to call it GitHub provider. And then I'm going to pass in some values here. So we know we need to pass in client ID, client secret, user pool, and user pool client. So for client ID, we're going to use secret GitHub client ID. I'll explain what this is in a second. And then for client secret, we're going to pass in a secret called GitHub client secret. And then for user pool, we'll pass in user pool. And for user pool client, we'll pass in user pool client. So now we have everything we need in this file. So we're going to create this new GitHub provider, which is going to create the API gateway, the Lambda, and it's connect all the Lambda functions and put everything together. Now, real quick, we have these two secrets here for GitHub client ID and GitHub client secret, and this is imported from right here. If we go into the official documentation here and we search for secret, there is a whole section on secret environmental variables. When you're running in sandbox mode, you can add in secrets really quickly by adding in this command here. You can run npx amplify sandbox secret set. So let's do that. So we're going to go in, I'm just going to copy this npx amplify sandbox secret set. And then the first one we need is this GitHub. You can see right here, GitHub client ID. So I'm going to type in GitHub client ID. And now we need to put that value in. So I'm going to the two values that I set when we created the GitHub OAuth app. I'm going to grab the client ID and I'm just going to paste it in here. Great. And now I need to do the secret one. So it's going to call GitHub underscore client underscore secret. So I'm going to copy that from my other screen as well. And I'm going to paste it. All right, so those two values are now set, which is what I need. So now we need to go into the GitHub provider. So the first thing I want to do is I need to set up the backend ID to resolve secrets. And this is in the documentation. Essentially, I'm going to use this syntax here, and I'll copy and paste it. And this will allow us, this backend identifier will allow us to use secrets inside the stack. So we have to pass it in the backend name, the backend namespace, and deployment type. This is all through the CD context key, which will come from platform core. So just remember this. You can follow this along when you are following along this. You can look inside the documentation for this. So the next thing we want to do is set up the user lambdas. So there's going to be 3 of them, and let me just copy and paste them in here. All right, so we have 3 of them. One called user lambda, which is this one right here, and we'll call it user lambda. We'll use this URL file to URL path, which if we look at here, we have API user TS, that's the file, and then we'll do runtime Node.js 18. And then we have a token lambda, which will have API token. And then we'll have a private lambda, which will be this private one right here. And now it's time to set up the API gateway. And the API gateway has a few settings here. So let's do it. We'll do API GitHub gateway. And we'll do new API gateway. And remember, I already imported this in at the top. Just for the sake, I did import star as API gateway from CDK lib. And from here, we'll do we'll do the REST API, which is this one right here. And then we'll pass in this, and then the API, we'll call it API gateway. So now we'll need to add in and configure this gateway. So first, we're gonna do REST API name. I'm gonna call it GitHub API gateway. We can add a description if we want. So I'll call this is for GitHub API login. And we'll do deploy options. I'll put stage name is prod. And then we'll do default CORS options. So this makes it so we don't have any issues with CORS. And I'll just copy and paste that in. And then we'll do endpoint configuration. And we'll put in types. And we'll have API gateway.endpoint type regional, which will just make sure that we have for any regional API with the custom domain name. All right, so now we have an API gateway that we have set up. And this should be const. And we'll use this in a second. Oops, I made a quick mistake. I had to move the backend identifier above the constructor, and then inside the constructor is where I added the Lambda functions and the API gateway hub. So that looks good. Okay, so if we continue on, now that we have the API gateway in there and we have Lambda functions, is immediate set up some resources. So these resources, I'll go ahead and copy and paste them in here. So this is going to connect our API gateway to the Lambda functions we just created. So first is the one for user. So I just do API gateway hub.root add resource for user. I set the Lambda integration to the user Lambda, and then I set it up to Git. So this way it'll do a Git request, will be available. I also do one for token, and I pass in the token Lambda, and this will be for post. And now we'll need to create a user pool authorizer. So let me copy and paste that in here. This is the user pool authorizer. It's use new API gateway CFN authorizer, and you pass in the user pool authorizer, API gateway GitHub API REST API ID. Cognito user pool is the type. I have to pass in the ARN from the props that we passed in here, and then we set it to authorization as the identity source. And so this goes back to our Excalidraw, where we needed to make sure we set up an authorizer here with the API gateway, so that way this private one can only be used by users that are authorized. And that's why we have this user pool authorizer. So now we can create this protected route. So in this protected route, we add the resource to the API gateway like we did earlier. And then we also add the Lambda function that we called private Lambda. We had it allow, you can get it using HTTP GET, but this time we added in this authorizer. So this authorizer we just created called user pool authorizer. We now add it as the authorizer for it when you do a GET request. And then the authorization type is Cognito. So that way only authenticated users will be able to get to this resource, this private. And then if they do, they'll see hello user. And now the last part here, and maybe a little bit more complicated, is the set up the GitHub identity provider. The purpose of this, like I said earlier, is this GitHub identity provider will be connected to this user pool client that we already created, and it's going to allow us to use GitHub OAuth to log in. We'll basically create all the endpoints and almost act like it's an OIDC provider when it's not really one. So that's why we created all these private and token Lambda functions. So let's take a look at it, what it looks like here. So we have this new user pool identity provider OIDC off of Cognito. It's going to be called GitHub provider. And now we need to pass in that client ID and client secret. And what we're going to do is we're going to do props.clientID resolve, and then we have to use that backend identifier and then unwrap it. And this is essentially anytime you are using secrets and you're using your own stack, you have to use this syntax. Then we pass in the user pool that we got from the props. The issuer URL is just github.com. It's going to be a GET request. And then the 4 endpoints that I was talking about earlier. So if we go back to our graph, we need to have the authorization, token, user info, and JWKS URI. And this will create a GitHub OIDC provider. So for the authorization, it's already there. So this is the login OAuth authorized through GitHub. And we can actually grab the URL from the API gateway we just created and grab the URL and then have it connect to /token for the JWKS URI. Same thing for the token endpoint, and same thing for you. And then for the user info, you go to user. So those will be all connected to these Lambda functions. Like this user will obviously bring back the user information. Now here is the attribute mapping. If we remember earlier, we had this email, preferred username, and profile picture. Well, when we go to this user endpoint, we need to map what's coming back from that endpoint to the mapping. So for email, we map in, it's called email, and we use this cognito.provider attribute. For name, it's called name, and we map that to preferred username. And the avatar URL is the profile picture. And those are the 3 that will be mapped in. And the last but not least thing we need to do is once we create this GitHub identity provider, we need to add it to the client that was created, that user pool client. So to do that, I'm going to copy and paste it in here. And so here's the user pool client. So we passed in the props, that user pool client. We're going to do .node default child, which is basically essentially what this does is it brings it back down to the L1 construct, which is the lower level CDK construct. And now we can use .supported identity providers. We can pass in any of the existing providers in there so we don't overwrite that. And then also the new one we just created, this GitHub provider.provider name. And that's it. We do have 3 things here at the top that I commented out. So we can bring these back in, but you can see if we highlight over, it says API has new initializers, definitely it's never assigned anywhere. So this is where we can assign it if we want to. We can bring this back up to whoever instantiates this could have access to these if we need it. So I'll put these back at the bottom. Okay, so this looks all good to me. And now if we go back to our backend TS, we're initializing this new class. We're passing these client IDs. We set these secrets. So we should be good to go. So to get started here, to actually get this provisioned, we need to run npx amplify sandbox. And this will start the provisioning. And this will probably take about 5 6-7 minutes the first time it goes through it. So we'll just wait a moment. While it's provisioning, we can do a few things. So we have this Nuxt app. So I'm going to install AWS Amplify in it. Okay. And if you ever get any errors installing AWS Amplify, you can do -- force, depending on if there's an issue with one of the dependencies. Okay, so it's installed now, and we can run npm run dev. So looks like that stack is still being initialized. And that'll open up localhost 3000. If we look at localhost 3000, we're going to see the basic Nuxt out of the box app, since I haven't changed anything. And what we're going to do now is in our pages folder, so we're going to go to source or app folder, we'll have this page file. And I'm just going to do a little cleanup here, and we'll see just a basic hello world right here. And we're not going to really do too much at the front end. I just want to see if I can log into an account into GitHub. And luckily there's a few ways we can do that. So I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call it sign in with Google. We'll make it async. And then we'll wait, sign in. And it's called sign in with redirect. And it automatically imported in there. And then from there, we could tell it what to sign in. So I'm going to set a provider. Provider, we need to do custom here, and this will be GitHub. There we go. And then we want to do something that grabs some private information from that private endpoint that we created. So we can make sure that works. So I'm going to do get private info. We're going to async. And then from here, I'm going to grab the tokens. We're going to do fetch auth session. And by the way, at the top of this, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use client so we don't have any issues. I'm going to wait the fetch auth session, and then I'm going to get a response. And I'm just copy and pasting this. And this get will import this in from our API. So we have this API. So we'll have this get, we'll have this API slash, this API name is API, and we'll set that up in a moment. It's going to go to the /private, and then it's going to send in this authorization ID token that we received back from the backend. For this return here, let's add some code. So first, we can say hello and log in. And then we want to add in some buttons. So we'll add a button here, and we'll have this sign in with Google or with GitHub. And we'll just on click, and this will go to that new method that we created called sign in with Google. Sign in with, I just noticed I called it sign in with Google. It should be sign in with GitHub. Oops. And this will go to sign in with GitHub. All right, so let's add in a use state here. So I'm going to have a user info and a set user info. I'm going to use use state null. Make sure that's imported in. And then I want to add in a new function to grab the user information out of using our JavaScript library from the backend. So I'm going to copy. So I'm going to use get current user info. It's going to be async function. And then I'm going to grab the session information. I'm going to use this method called fetch user attributes. And then I can do the set user info. And I'll just add this all in here. So I'm going to add in a picture, which will be session.picture. And then I'll add in an email, which will be session.email. And then finally, we'll do preferred, I think it's called preferred username, and I'll do that session.preferred username. And it's giving us a warning here that object loader may only specify known properties and picture does not exist and type previous state null. And for this use state here, I can add in some types. So I'll just add in some types real quickly. All right, so now we have our set user info in here that we want to call. So I'm going to create another button, and this is going to get current user info. And then here I can actually display that information. So let's do something like this. So if, okay, great. So now I have an image here. I have grabbing user info and preferred username. Now there's one more configuration that we need to do. And so we're going to go and create a new file. We're going to call it auth.tsx. And this is going to set up our authentication so we can create everything we need to and connect to our JavaScript library. If you notice now this, if we notice when we go into our terminal here that the sandbox is done running, it has all the values, everything's done. And it created this new file called amplify configuration.json in the root folder of our app. And this is what we're going to use to create, we're going to use this file with our JavaScript library so everything is connected correctly. So let me go ahead and set this up and I'll show you how it works. As I was filling in the auth information, I wanted to check one thing real quickly, and that is we'll need to grab the API gateway, and also I want to double check something on Cognito. So if I go here, I'm logged back into my console. I can type in API gateway. Inside here, I'll click API gateway. And then if I come through here, I can see the new GitHub API gateway that was just created earlier. And I can click stages. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And this is going to be the prod URL. And the second thing I wanted to show you guys is that I realized my console was set to US West 2 and not US East 1. So everything is in US West 2. So that's going to cause a little bit of an issue because earlier when I set up the OAuth, I set it up for US East 1. So I can change that real quickly. So here I'm back in my GitHub login, and I just went down here and I changed this from US East 1 to US West 2. So that way it all matched. So I definitely make sure you do that. Otherwise things won't work. All right, so now I have the invoke URL. So let me show you what I did here. So in this auth.tsx file, I imported React, Amplify, and then config. And then I ran this amplify configure command. So this is all the information you need. And this sets up auth and Cognito. I pass in the user pool ID, which is from that configuration file, the amplify configuration JSON file, the client ID, the identity pool. And by the way, this is all typed, and this is in the documentation too, so you don't have to memorize this. Allow guest access true. I set up the password format, required lowercase, all this, user attributes. And then right here for the domain, I go ahead and put that domain in, and difference being now is US West 2 instead of US East 1, because obviously I was in the wrong domain earlier. And then I put the redirect sign-in URL, localhost 3000, sign out 3000, response token, response type token. Here's the scopes. And then this endpoint is the Cognito endpoint that I showed you earlier. That's from the API, not Cognito, but it's the API gateway endpoint. And that's right here. So if I did this all correctly, I should work. And then I exported auth, and I just, essentially you're going to use this to surround it. It's a client component, surround it in the layout. So I'm going to add this to the layout. I import auth from auth, and then I'm just surrounding the whole app with this auth right here. And that should do it. So if we come back to our page TSX file, it should show correctly. So let's try it out. All right, so let's see if it works. So I have my page here. I have sign in with GitHub, get current user info. I also added one more button, get private info, which just calls this get private info to see if this endpoint works, and then console logs it out. So let's try this. I'm gonna click sign in with GitHub. I'll go ahead and put in my information in. Cool, so now it's asking me if I want to get access to all my different accounts here. I'm just gonna click authorize at the bottom, and then this will redirect back to my app. Great, and now if I click get current user info, you see here's me. Looks like it grabbed my name, all this information that's now stored in there. And if I go to the console and click get private info, I gotta wait it. So I'm gonna wait response body.text. I click get private info. Cool, it says hello user. Yeah, it looks like everything's working. So now I've been able to create a private endpoint I can get current my information from the back end, and I was able to sign in. One last thing we could do if we want. So right now, this is working in our sandbox environment. And so this is an ephemeral environment, and when it is stopped, it gets deleted. So if we wanted to have this for a production environment, we would need to push this up to the hosting option. So if you go into the official documentation, you click deploy and host, you can look at the full stack workflows, and you can see how you can pull this basically into a production environment. You have to go into the console and set up the GitHub repository inside of it. If you want to do that, I actually did that in a previous video. I'll link it in the description, and I went through the whole process. One thing we'd probably need to do, since we're using GitHub as a login, we would need to fix all these URLs that I showed you earlier, especially these redirect sign-in URLs. We probably want to get our own custom domain name, which would make the most amount of sense. So that way it redirects to the custom domain name. So if you guys are really interested in that, let me know. I can do that in a future video. But for now, I think this is fine to stop here, because this really gives you an idea of how to set this up and add this to your own environment. So let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks. Take care. And make sure you leave a comment too.